The most dangerous warning is the one delivered by someone the world has already decided to ignore. On a chilly Thursday evening, the dining room of Hawthorne House glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, its polished wood floors reflecting the soft light of hundreds of candles. Conversations drifted gently through the air, accompanied by the quiet notes of a grand piano tucked into the corner of the elegant restaurant. Every table was filled with executives, attorneys, and families celebrating special occasions, but nearly every eye paused for a moment when Ethan Caldwell stepped through the entrance. At 43 years old, the billionaire founder of Caldwell Industries had become the kind of man whose arrival subtly changed the atmosphere of every room. He acknowledged the maitre d' with a courteous nod before taking his usual corner table overlooking the city skyline. For Ethan, this dinner was nothing more than another brief pause between meetings, acquisitions, and decisions that affected thousands of employees. Across the dining room, Grace Harper adjusted the sleeve of her crisp black and white uniform before lifting a silver tray from the service station. She had worked at Hawthorne House for almost 2 years, yet few guests remembered her face after leaving. That had never bothered her. She had quietly learned that people often revealed the most when they believed no one was paying attention. As she approached Ethan's table with a cup of freshly brewed coffee, her calm blue eyes briefly swept across the room. A businessman checked his watch too often. A woman near the entrance discreetly watched the exit instead of her companion. A server she had never seen before disappeared through a hallway reserved for employees. Tiny details. Ordinary by themselves. Together, they formed a pattern that made her heart beat slow instead of race. Grace carefully placed the porcelain cup beside Ethan's folded menu. Then she slipped the dinner check beneath his hand with a movement so natural that no one nearby noticed. Ethan thanked her without looking up, assuming the bill had been delivered early by mistake. Only after she walked several steps away did he unfold the small leather check holder. Inside, resting above the receipt, was a single square piece of white paper. 7 handwritten words stared back at him in neat blue ink. You are in serious trouble. Leave now. Do not look back. Ethan frowned, certain someone had confused him with another guest. He lifted his eyes across the crowded dining room, searching for the waitress who had served him only seconds earlier. Grace had already resumed taking another table's order as though nothing unusual had happened. She never glanced in his direction again. Yet just before Ethan folded the note closed, he noticed one final detail written in much smaller letters beneath the warning. Trust me for exactly 5 minutes. After that, I cannot help you anymore. Ethan read the note twice before folding it back into the leather check holder. His first instinct was to dismiss it as an elaborate prank, perhaps the kind of harmless joke that occasionally found its way into expensive restaurants where wealthy guests attracted unwanted attention. Yet something refused to let him laugh it away. The handwriting was steady. There were no dramatic flourishes, no attempt to frighten him with impossible claims. It was almost painfully simple, as though the person who wrote it had measured every word before putting ink on paper. He slowly looked toward Grace again. She was pouring sparkling water for an elderly couple near the window with the same calm expression she had worn only moments earlier. There was no urgency in her movements and no hint that she expected him to react. That unsettled him more than the message itself. Ethan quietly checked the time on his Swiss watch. 4 minutes remained. He had spent more than 20 years making decisions based on evidence rather than instinct, yet the tiny note had planted a question logic could not immediately answer. Around him the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm. Crystal glasses reflected warm candlelight. Soft piano music drifted across the room. Waiters carried perfectly arranged plates between tables with practiced precision. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Then Ethan began noticing details he normally would have ignored. A man seated near the entrance had not touched his dinner since arriving nearly 15 minutes earlier. Another guest repeatedly glanced toward the emergency exit instead of speaking with his companion. A newly hired server wearing an unfamiliar name tag entered the dining room empty-handed before disappearing again through a staff corridor. None of those observations proved anything. Together, however, they formed the same uneasy pattern that Grace's eyes had quietly recognized before anyone else. Ethan reached for his phone and sent a brief message to his driver. "Bring the car to the front entrance immediately. No delay." Seconds later the reply arrived. "Already waiting outside, sir." Ethan stood slowly, placing several folded bills inside the check holder even though he had barely touched his meal. As he buttoned his jacket, Grace walked past carrying another tray. Without turning her head, she spoke so softly that only he could hear. "Do not stop until you are 3 blocks away." She continued walking without breaking her pace or acknowledging that she had spoken. Ethan left through the front doors into the cool evening air. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement after a brief shower. His driver opened the rear door, and the black sedan pulled away from the restaurant. Ethan looked through the rear window as the building grew smaller behind him. Exactly 5 minutes after he received the note, flashing emergency lights appeared from every direction, surrounding the restaurant and closing the entire block. Ethan stared in stunned silence, realizing the quiet waitress had known something no one else had seen. The black sedan continued several more blocks before Ethan finally asked his driver to pull over beside a quiet city park. Neither man spoke for a moment. Through the windshield, flashing red and blue lights still reflected faintly against the evening sky several streets behind them. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the small handwritten note once again. The words had not changed, but their meaning had. Someone inside that restaurant had seen a danger before anyone else, and somehow the only person who chose to warn him was a waitress he had never met. His phone vibrated repeatedly with incoming messages from executives, news alerts, and concerned colleagues, but one headline immediately caught his attention. Authorities had unexpectedly sealed off Hawthorne House as part of an ongoing investigation involving financial evidence connected to several private business meetings held there over recent weeks. Very few details had been released, yet one fact became instantly clear. Had Ethan remained inside for only a few more minutes, his presence would almost certainly have placed him at the center of questions he knew nothing about. He slowly leaned back against the leather seat, replaying every second of the evening. Grace had never appeared frightened. She had never urged him with dramatic gestures or desperate words. She had simply observed, decided, and acted. That quiet confidence stayed with him. "Turn the car around," Ethan finally said. His driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Back to the restaurant, sir." Ethan nodded. "I need to speak with the waitress." By the time they returned, police vehicles still surrounded the block, but the dining room lights had been turned off. Employees stood together on the sidewalk answering routine questions while customers quietly waited nearby. Ethan scanned every face. Grace was nowhere to be found. He approached the restaurant manager, who immediately recognized him. "I am looking for the waitress who served my table," Ethan said. "Her name is Grace Harper." The manager looked surprised. "Grace finished her shift about 10 minutes ago. She clocked out early after helping everyone leave calmly." Ethan frowned. "Do you have her phone number?" The manager hesitated before shaking his head apologetically. "Company policy does not allow us to share employee information. Besides, Grace keeps to herself. She comes to work, does her job, and goes home. Most of us know very little about her." As Ethan prepared to leave, one of the senior servers quietly stepped closer. "If you are wondering how she knew something was wrong," he said softly, "you are not the first person to ask that question." Ethan stopped. "What do you mean?" The older man looked toward the dark restaurant before answering. "Grace notices things that the rest of us never see. Little details. Small changes. Patterns. More than once she has quietly solved problems before anyone realized they existed." Ethan looked once more at the empty sidewalk where Grace should have been standing. For the first time in years, he found himself chasing an answer that could not be bought, negotiated, or calculated. It could only be understood. The following morning, Ethan arrived at Caldwell Industries before sunrise, but the city beyond his office windows could not compete with the questions occupying his mind. He had built an entire career by trusting evidence, patterns, and careful analysis, yet the most important decision he had made in recent years had been based entirely on the quiet confidence of a woman carrying a coffee tray. He placed the folded note on his desk beside the morning newspaper. Every headline focused on the unexpected investigation at Hawthorne House. Reporters speculated about business records, confidential meetings, and influential guests, but none of the articles explained how Grace could have known that something was wrong before anyone else appeared to notice. Ethan opened his calendar and quietly postponed several non-essential appointments. His executive assistant looked surprised but asked no questions. By late morning, he found himself driving back toward the neighborhood where the restaurant stood. Hawthorne House remained closed behind temporary barriers while employees gathered personal belongings under the supervision of management. Ethan recognized the restaurant manager and walked over with calm determination. "I would like to ask one more question about Grace Harper," he said. The manager studied him for a moment before answering. "I cannot give you her private information, but I can tell you something unusual. Grace notices details that everyone else overlooks. Last winter she realized our refrigeration system was failing before any alarm sounded because the condensation on one serving tray looked different. She quietly warned us, and the repair prevented thousands of dollars in losses. A few months later she recognized that a regular customer was showing early signs of a medical emergency simply because he held his coffee cup differently than usual. She calmly asked another guest to call for help. She has an incredible eye for patterns." Ethan listened carefully. None of those stories sounded dramatic. They sounded believable. Grace was not predicting the future. She was observing the present more carefully than everyone around her. As he prepared to leave, one of the senior chefs stepped outside carrying a small cardboard box. "You are Mr. Caldwell, correct?" the chef asked. Ethan nodded. The chef opened the box and removed a neatly folded navy scarf. "Grace asked me to give this to you if you came back looking for her." Ethan accepted it with quiet surprise. Wrapped inside the scarf was another handwritten note. The familiar blue ink immediately caught his attention. It read, "You left because you trusted me once. If you truly want answers, come alone to Riverside Public Library tomorrow at 7 in the evening. Bring the first note. Tell no one where you are going." The restaurant was only the beginning. Ethan slowly folded the message and looked toward the empty dining room behind the locked glass doors. For the first time, he realized Grace had never been trying to impress him. She had been leading him toward a truth that neither wealth nor influence could uncover alone. The next evening arrived with a steady autumn breeze sweeping through the quiet streets as Ethan parked several blocks away from Riverside Public Library exactly as the note had instructed. He came alone. His driver had been given the evening off, and even his executive assistant believed he was attending a private investment dinner across town. The folded warning remained safely inside the pocket of his navy coat, its edges already softened from being opened so many times. Ethan climbed the wide stone steps and entered the historic building just as the clock above the entrance struck 7. The library felt almost timeless. Tall wooden shelves stretched toward an ornate ceiling, warm reading lamps illuminated polished oak tables, and the faint scent of old books filled the peaceful silence. Only a handful of visitors remained inside, quietly turning pages or working on laptops. Nothing appeared unusual. Then he noticed Grace sitting alone near the back of the main reading room beside a large window overlooking the river. She wore a simple cream sweater instead of her restaurant uniform, her honey blonde hair resting loosely over one shoulder. Without the familiar apron, she looked less like a waitress and more like someone who had quietly stepped back into a life she had once left behind. She greeted him with a calm smile. "Thank you for trusting the note," she said softly. Ethan took the chair across from her. "You have my attention," he replied. "Now tell me how you knew what was going to happen." Grace shook her head gently. I did not know what was going to happen. I knew enough to recognize that something was wrong. Ethan remained silent, allowing her to continue. People believe danger always announces itself with loud voices or dramatic moments. Most of the time it begins with tiny inconsistencies that nobody bothers to notice. She reached into a canvas tote bag and removed a small notebook filled with neatly organized handwritten observations. She opened several pages without sliding it across the table. For months I have been recording patterns. Different faces appearing together in different places. Meetings scheduled at unusual hours. Conversations that stopped the moment certain people approached. Individually they meant nothing. Together they formed a picture. Ethan studied her carefully. Why tell me instead of the authorities? Grace looked directly into his eyes for the first time since they met. Because the pattern does not end at the restaurant. Ethan felt the atmosphere shift. What do you mean? Grace lowered her voice even further. Several of the names I observed belong to people who have attended private events connected to Caldwell Industries. I do not believe you are responsible for anything, but I believe someone close to your company has been quietly using your reputation as a shield. Ethan stared at her, the library suddenly feeling much quieter than before. Grace slowly closed the notebook. The warning I gave you saved one evening. The reason I asked you here is because the real problem has only just begun. Grace waited until the last librarian quietly wheeled a cart of returned books toward the back office before opening the notebook again. Instead of names written in dramatic circles or elaborate diagrams, every page contained simple observations organized by dates, locations, and ordinary details that most people would never consider important. Ethan leaned forward as she turned each page. One entry described the same luxury sedan appearing outside 3 different charity events hosted by Caldwell Industries. Another noted identical leather portfolios carried by executives who claimed to have never met one another. Several pages listed conversations that ended the instant a particular employee entered the room. None of the entries accused anyone of wrongdoing. They merely recorded patterns with remarkable patience. You kept all of this while working double shifts at the restaurant? Ethan asked quietly. Grace nodded. Observation costs nothing. It only requires attention. Ethan looked at her with growing respect. What did you do before becoming a waitress? Grace smiled faintly, as though remembering a life that belonged to someone else. I studied financial risk analysis. After graduate school I worked for a consulting firm that specialized in identifying operational irregularities for large organizations. Ethan blinked in surprise. Then why leave? Grace rested her fingertips on the closed notebook. Because after my father became seriously ill, I left my career to take care of him. By the time he recovered, my position had been eliminated during a restructuring. Months became years. I accepted restaurant work while searching for another opportunity, but eventually people stopped seeing the analyst and only saw the waitress. Ethan remained silent. He realized how easily titles shaped assumptions. At the restaurant he had noticed only the uniform, never imagining the experience behind it. Grace continued in her calm voice. Serving tables taught me something valuable. People often speak freely when they believe the person refilling their coffee is invisible. I never searched for secrets. I simply noticed patterns that others ignored. She slid one page toward Ethan for the first time. It contained a timeline connecting several public events attended by executives from his company with meetings held at different restaurants and hotels across the city. Every event appeared ordinary until viewed together. Ethan studied the dates carefully. Several involved senior managers he trusted completely. Why bring this to me instead of confronting them? Grace asked him a question instead of answering. If you discovered something uncertain about people you had worked beside for years, would you accuse them without understanding the full picture? Ethan slowly shook his head. Exactly, Grace replied. Patterns deserve investigation, not assumptions. She gently closed the notebook and looked toward the dark river outside the library windows. I do not need you to believe every observation tonight. I only need you to look at your own company with fresh eyes. Once you do, I believe you will begin seeing the same details that have been quietly waiting there all along. When Ethan returned to Caldwell Industries the following morning, he resisted every instinct to launch an immediate internal investigation. Grace's final words echoed through his mind with remarkable clarity. Patterns deserve investigation, not assumptions. For the first time in years, he walked through his own headquarters without announcing his arrival. Instead of heading directly to the executive floor, he visited departments he rarely entered, greeted employees whose names he had never learned, and quietly observed the rhythm of the company that carried his family name. Small details began to emerge almost immediately. Certain senior managers consistently left meetings together yet returned separately. Financial reports arrived precisely on schedule, but supporting documents often appeared hours later. Routine vendor approvals carried identical wording despite being submitted by different departments. None of it proved misconduct. Yet after listening to Grace describe how patterns slowly revealed larger truths, Ethan found himself looking beyond individual events. By late afternoon he invited the company's longtime internal auditor, Margaret Ellis, into his office. Margaret had worked beside Ethan for nearly 18 years and had earned his complete confidence through careful judgment rather than dramatic conclusions. Instead of making accusations, Ethan simply asked her to review several ordinary transactions from the past 12 months without informing anyone else. Margaret looked mildly surprised by the unusual request but agreed without hesitation. 3 days passed before she returned carrying a slim folder. Nothing here is illegal by itself, she explained calmly. However, there are recurring approval chains that deserve another look. The same small group of executives appears repeatedly whenever unusually complex contracts move through the system. Ethan quietly compared Margaret's notes with the observations Grace had recorded in her notebook. Different sources. Different methods. Yet several names appeared on both lists. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. That evening Ethan called Grace from the public number she had written inside the notebook. She answered after the second ring with the same calm voice he remembered from the restaurant. "You started seeing the patterns," she said before he spoke. Ethan smiled faintly. "How did you know?" Grace laughed softly. "Because people who truly pay attention stop asking whether something feels wrong. They begin asking why the same details keep repeating." Ethan thanked her for opening his eyes. After a brief silence he asked the question that had stayed with him since their first meeting. "Why help me?" "We were strangers." Grace answered without hesitation. "Because I never believed the warning belonged only to you. Thousands of honest employees depend on the choices made inside your company. If something was quietly drifting in the wrong direction, protecting one person was never the real goal. Protecting everyone who trusted the company was." Ethan slowly lowered the phone. For the first time since receiving the folded note inside the restaurant, he understood that Grace had never been trying to rescue a billionaire. She had simply refused to ignore the truth after recognizing it. Over the following 2 weeks, Ethan allowed the quiet review to continue without announcing any special investigation. He changed nothing about his daily routine, attended board meetings as usual, and spoke to every executive with the same confidence they had always known. Behind the scenes, however, Margaret carefully expanded her analysis while Ethan compared every new observation with the notebook Grace had entrusted to him. The similarities became impossible to dismiss. A series of consulting contracts had been approved through unnecessarily complicated review paths. Several outside firms repeatedly appeared in projects that had no obvious connection to one another. Individual decisions seemed perfectly reasonable when viewed alone, yet together they formed a network of unusual relationships that deserved careful examination. Ethan realized Grace had been right from the beginning. The danger had never been hidden behind one dramatic event. It had been quietly growing inside ordinary routines that no one had questioned for years. One afternoon he invited Grace to visit Caldwell Industries after business hours. She hesitated before accepting, making it clear that she did not want attention or recognition. When she arrived, she wore the same simple cream sweater she had worn at the library. Ethan greeted her personally instead of asking an assistant to escort her upstairs. As they walked through the nearly empty headquarters, Grace observed the building with quiet curiosity rather than admiration. She paused beside framed photographs celebrating company milestones and studied the employees smiling in each picture. "This company was built by many people," she said softly. "That is why protecting its integrity matters." Ethan led her into a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Margaret was already waiting with several organized folders spread across the table. She welcomed Grace warmly, not as a waitress, but as someone whose careful observations had helped reveal questions worth asking. Together they spent hours comparing timelines, travel schedules, public events, and approval records. Grace never claimed certainty. Whenever she noticed a connection, she explained exactly why it deserved another look instead of insisting it proved anything. Margaret smiled more than once. "You think exactly like an experienced analyst," she admitted. Grace answered with quiet humility. "Good analysis begins with curiosity, not conclusions." As the evening drew to a close, Ethan stood beside the conference room window watching the city lights appear one by one. He realized something far more valuable than a business review had taken place. For years he had measured talent through resumes, titles, and office doors. Yet the person who had helped him see his own organization more clearly had entered his life carrying a serving tray instead of a briefcase. Looking toward Grace, he said with complete sincerity, "When this review is finished, I hope you will consider returning to the profession that never should have lost you." Grace smiled gently but did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked back at the city below and quietly replied, "Let us finish protecting the people who already trust this company. Everything else can wait until the truth has finally been given a chance to speak for itself." 3 months later, the review reached its quiet conclusion without headlines, dramatic announcements, or public celebration. Independent auditors confirmed that several internal processes required significant correction, and a number of long-standing business relationships were responsibly re-examined before they could create greater problems for the company. Caldwell Industries emerged stronger not because one person had solved every question, but because its leadership had chosen to listen before ignoring the small signs that had been hiding in plain sight. Ethan stood before his executive team on a clear Monday morning with a single sheet of paper instead of his usual presentation. He spoke about responsibility, humility, and the danger of believing that important ideas could come only from impressive titles. Around the conference table, experienced executives listened more carefully than ever before. That afternoon, Ethan walked into Hawthorne House once again. The restaurant had reopened, and the familiar warmth of polished wood, soft music, and quiet conversation filled the room exactly as it had on the evening everything changed. Grace was finishing her final shift. She smiled when she saw him, though her expression carried no surprise. "I thought you might come back," she said gently. Ethan placed a small envelope on the table between them. "This is not a reward," he explained. "It is an invitation." Grace opened the envelope and found an offer to become Director of Strategic Risk Analysis for the Caldwell Community Foundation, where her work would focus on protecting charitable programs, improving operational transparency, and creating opportunities for talented people whose abilities had been overlooked because of difficult circumstances. Ethan had personally written one sentence at the bottom of the letter. "Character deserves a chance before reputation earns another one." Grace looked up with quiet gratitude. "You finally stopped seeing the uniform," she said with a warm smile. Ethan nodded. "You helped me see people before positions." Several weeks later, Grace walked through the doors of her new office carrying the same small notebook that had begun everything. She placed it carefully inside a desk drawer, not as a reminder of danger, but as a reminder to keep paying attention to ordinary details that others might overlook. Ethan watched from across the hallway before returning to his own office with a sense of peace he had not expected to find. Looking through the city skyline, he realized that the most valuable decision of his career had never appeared in a board meeting, a financial report, or a contract. It had arrived folded inside a restaurant check, written by someone the world barely noticed. From that day forward, every new manager at Caldwell Industries learned the same lesson during orientation. The strongest companies are not built by the loudest voices in the room. They are built by leaders wise enough to recognize quiet integrity wherever it appears, because wisdom does not always wear an expensive suit. Sometimes it quietly serves your coffee before protecting your future.